Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown. Tonight, as the cold mist settles and the darkness deepens, we'll dive into a haunting tale about a creature whispered of by the people of Michigan, the Dogman. This story takes us back to Halloween night in 1987, when a man named John drove through a forest near his home and unexpectedly encountered something he'd never believed could be real. With blazing red eyes and coarse black fur, the Dogman left a terror in the night that John would never forget. Prepare yourself, dim the lights, and listen closely to experience this chilling encounter. Halloween night, 1987, Michigan was engulfed in an unusual chill. It wasn't the cold from wind or frost, but a spine-chilling, nameless cold that crept into the air, into every breath. The night was pitch black, the treetops stretching toward the sky like shadows twisting in the wind. Everything seemed ominously still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. John was driving home from work, steering his old car down the deserted Chaudehuy Road. This was a familiar route, a quiet path surrounded by dense woods. He had traveled this road countless times without feeling anything. But tonight, something was off, something hidden, obscure, and menacing lurked nearby. He felt as though someone or something was watching him from afar, from the dark spaces between the trees. He pressed the gas, the car cutting through the darkness like an arrow shot into the void. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something by the roadside, a tall figure standing motionless in the empty road. His heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened as his mind tried to process the sight before him. It was neither human nor animal. It was the Dogman, standing upright in the forest. The creature was over 7 feet tall, covered in thick, jet-black fur, with blazing red eyes that pierced through the darkness. Those eyes looked straight at him, hollow, cold, yet filled with a formidable threat. John couldn't tear his gaze away from it, a gaze that seemed to freeze every feeling inside him for a moment. Those red eyes didn't just look at him. They seemed to bore into his very soul, awakening every primal fear he had ever suppressed. John felt as if someone was squeezing the air from his lungs, his heart pounding as if it would leap from his chest. A chill spread throughout his body, every cell screaming that he had to get out of there immediately. His hand shook as he reached for the gear shift, trying to press the gas and reverse the car. But just as he moved back, the creature took a step forward. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from its throat, the sound like thunder echoing through the night. The Dogman moved closer, each heavy step resonating on the pavement, its red eyes fixed on John, as though it had already decided he would be its prey tonight. John gasped for breath, fighting to contain the overwhelming terror rising within him. This creature, this thing was unlike anything he'd ever seen, something beyond understanding, indescribable. Then, following a primal instinct, he slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, the car jerking backward at full speed. The headlights flashed through the darkness, and in that final fleeting moment, he saw the Dogman standing there, motionless, its eyes still fixed on him, unblinking. It was as if it knew that no matter how fast he drove away, his fear would forever remain here, on this road, under its blazing red eyes. John pressed the gas pedal so hard that his trembling hands had to grip the wheel tightly for balance. But his eyes never left the rearview mirror. The darkness outside was thick and cold, like a blanket covering the road. The headlights cast flickering beams that danced over the trees lining the path, making them look like ghosts waiting to snatch anything that strayed too close. Then he saw it, the Dogman, clearly visible in his rearview mirror. It was still there, just a few dozen yards behind, relentlessly following as though the entire forest were pushing it toward him. John shuddered. It was running on 2 legs, leaping forward like a wild beast, its blazing red eyes piercing the darkness. Each thud of its feet sounded like hammer blows inside his head, relentless and frantic. He could hear its growling from behind, merging with the roar of the engine strained to its limits, creating a manic symphony in the darkness. The Dogman was closing in, and John could feel each of its leaps making the ground tremble. as if this monstrous creature had been born solely to hunt him, its every breath threatening to swallow him into an endless abyss. "No, this can't be happening," John whispered, breathing heavily, his eyes glued to the road ahead, yet unable to resist glancing back into the rearview mirror. The Dogman's shadow seemed magnified, like the shadow of a demon from hell, charging forward at an unimaginable speed. He pushed the car even harder, squinting, staring down the road ahead. He felt nothing now except the surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins, each breath stolen by an invisible terror. It felt as if a cold hand were squeezing his heart. Then, a powerful thud sounded from behind, as though something heavy had struck the rear bumper. John screamed, gripping the wheel tightly as the car swerved, nearly veering off the road. He glanced back and saw the Dogman clinging to the bumper, its red eyes burning brighter than ever, like flames of death blazing in the night. Its black fur billowed, and its sharp fangs glinted through a menacing, savage grin. The Dogman raised one clawed hand, raking it across the car's rear, producing a screeching sound that echoed into the night. John felt as if he were being pulled into absolute terror, his body paralyzed, his mind reeling, but his survival instincts surged, and with a sudden move, he jerked the wheel, sending the car careening around a sharp bend. The Dogman was flung off the bumper, but it stood there, in the darkness, staring after him as the car sped away. John didn't dare look back again. He drove straight toward the distant lights of town, but he knew deep down that the creature hadn't given up. It merely stood there, in the shadows, as if to warn him that this chase had only just begun, and that no matter how far he ran, the Dogman's gaze would always be watching. After escaping back to town, John stopped, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his breath ragged as if he'd just survived a violent storm. But even though the Dogman was no longer chasing him, John knew deep down that he hadn't truly escaped its dark shadow. Over the following week, John couldn't shake the image of the Dogman's blazing red eyes. Those eyes seemed seared into his mind, appearing in every shadowy corner of his house. He kept trying to convince himself it was all just a hallucination, that this creature was nothing more than a phantom conjured by his imagination. But that belief didn't last long. Every night, nightmares pulled him back to the forest, where the Dogman stood tall, glaring at him with a sinister smile. The nightmare seemed to have a life of its own. Each time John closed his eyes, he found himself back in the dark woods. The Dogman would emerge from the shadows, slowly approaching him, its fiery red eyes lighting up the night. He tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat, as if he had lost the ability to speak. The Dogman simply stood there, its eyes like the fires of hell, piercing into his mind, awakening every hidden fear within him. Every time he jolted awake, he found himself alone in the pitch-black room, his heart pounding so fast he thought it might burst from his chest. Cold sweat dripped from his forehead, and the Dogman's red eyes seemed to linger somewhere in the darkness. He told himself it was just a nightmare. But when he stepped outside in the morning, something felt wrong. Right beneath his bedroom window, John found large footprints etched deeply into the ground. They were massive, misshapen, with long, sharp claws that gouged deep grooves into the damp soil. The footprints led from the edge of the forest, circled his house, and stopped right beneath his window, as if the creature had been standing there all night, watching him from outside. A chill ran down John's spine as he looked at those unmistakable footprints. He felt as if he were living in a horror movie, with the Dogman as a predator, patiently waiting for his moment of weakness. Despite telling himself it was just his imagination, John knew deep down that the creature was really watching him, and that their encounter in the woods was only the beginning. John began sensing the Dogman's presence everywhere. At night, he heard strange sounds in the woods behind his house, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and sometimes a low growl echoing from afar, like an unseen warning. Occasionally, the noise came from right outside his window, and though he didn't dare look out, he knew those red eyes were watching him from the shadows. Neighbors started noticing the changes in John. He grew withdrawn, constantly looking over his shoulder, with sunken eyes haunted by sleepless nights and hidden fears. He didn't dare tell anyone about the Dogman. Who would believe him? Who would believe a story about a half-man, half-beast with blazing red eyes and a sinister smile, haunting his life? Even John, once a strong and rational man, began doubting the reality of what he had experienced. That night, John sat alone in his dark room, the dim light from his desk lamp casting the shadow of a tall figure onto the wall. His eyes were fixed on the window. Though he pulled the curtains shut, he could feel the Dogman's gaze piercing through from the outside, as if the creature could see him despite any walls in between. Then, he heard a knock at the door. First, a gentle tap, then 2 steady knocks in rhythm. And with each sound, John's heart felt as though it stopped. He didn't dare move, didn't dare shift even slightly, just sat there as if paralyzed by sheer terror. He gripped the edge of his chair, eyes locked on the door, waiting for something to appear. The room fell silent, and then, from the other side of the door, a low voice rose. Almost a whisper, but thick and murky like the dark waters of hell itself. "I'm coming." "John!" The knocking stopped, and everything fell into a deathly silence. But John knew he would never truly be at peace. The Dogman was waiting, patient as a predator, biding its time until he finally broke. The next Halloween night came quickly, and the cold seemed deeper, heavier than before. John felt as though something was drawing closer with each passing day. Deep down, he knew the creature out there, the Dogman, had never truly left. It was only waiting, silently watching, biding its time until he could no longer run. John had tried to avoid everything that reminded him of the forest, of those fiery red eyes and the ominous shadow that had haunted his life. But on Halloween night, he realized he couldn't hide forever. Something within him compelled him to return to the forest. Like a man under a spell, he left his house, his legs moving as if pulled by some invisible force. A call from the depths of darkness. With a sharp knife tucked in his pocket and a flashlight in his hand, John entered the forest. He couldn't explain the powerful urge driving him. It felt like a primal instinct, a mix of fear and a strange desire to end whatever he had unwittingly awakened the previous Halloween night. His flashlight scanned over the blackened tree trunks, the thick darkness wrapping around him like an impenetrable curtain. The forest was eerily silent tonight. No insects, no rustling wind. The only sound was his footsteps crunching over dry leaves, echoing in the frigid air. He knew he had gone too far, but he kept moving, deeper into the woods, as if his legs had chosen this path without consulting his mind. Then, John saw them, large tracks on the ground, Dogman's footprints, pressed deeply into the soft earth as if the creature weighed a ton. Huge, misshapen prints with long, sharp claws, leading straight into the heart of the forest. With each step he took along the trail, his breathing grew faster, his hand cold as ice despite gripping the flashlight tightly. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence, the snap of a branch. John froze. His flashlight pointed straight into the darkness ahead. In the dim beam, Dogman's figure appeared, standing motionless among the trees. Its red eyes seemed to absorb the light, piercing through the space between them and striking him directly. Dogman stood there, silent yet menacing, its eyes unblinking, fixed on him like a patient predator waiting for its prey to walk into the trap. John felt paralyzed. His legs felt glued to the ground, his breath shallow and stifled. It was as if he was enveloped by pure, consuming fear, as if Dogman was not only before him, but had taken over his mind and consciousness. His fingers were stiff, and the flashlight nearly slipped from his hand as his gaze locked on a Dogman's red eyes. Then, Dogman began moving toward him. Each of its steps was slow, deliberate, but unwavering. John felt his breath being drained, his throat dry, and every plea for help trapped within. "Who are you?" John stammered, trying to suppress his trembling. Dogman stopped, its eyes blazing fiercely in the darkness. Then, as if from some distant realm, a deep, raspy voice echoed in his mind. not a sound, but a sensation, an ancient awareness older than the forest itself. "I am the darkness," the voice whispered, not in words, but something far more sinister and primal. "I am the nightmare you awakened, the shadow that has always waited. And now, you will never escape me." John felt the words pierce his mind, seeping into every vein, every cell. Dogman was no wild beast. It was the embodiment of something far deeper and more terrifying. It was the manifestation of primal darkness, of the fear humanity had buried for centuries, and now it had awakened, fueled by the very fear within him. Dogman took another step forward, and in that final moment, John's survival instinct flared. He screamed, turned, and ran, tearing through the forest with Dogman's roar echoing close behind. The darkness seemed to swallow him, the trees reaching out like shadows trying to trap him. Each step he took, Dogman's growls drew nearer, as though the entire forest had become its domain. Finally, after sprinting in terror, John broke out of the forest, skidding onto the damp ground. He lay there, gasping for air, his heart pounding so fiercely it felt like it might burst. He looked back at the forest's edge, but Dogman hadn't followed. It merely stood there, at the boundary, its red eyes glowing in the darkness, staring straight at him. Those eyes were like a curse, a promise that Dogman would never truly leave. It would always be there, in the shadows, waiting for another night, another moment, when darkness would fall again and the chase would resume. John staggered back home, feeling as if he had just escaped a nightmare. His body was exhausted, each step heavy as if weighed down by stones, and his mind was swirling with the haunting image of Dogman's fiery red eyes, glowing in the darkness, filled with terror and menace. Though the creature had stopped chasing him, John knew this fear would cling to him forever, like a shadow that would never leave. That night, John locked every door, drew every curtain, and sat alone in the darkened living room, his eyes hollow and empty. The only light was a small lamp on the table, casting a dim yellow glow that twisted every shadow in the room into something unsettling. He didn't dare close his eyes, because every time he did, Dogman's red eyes and dark form appeared just behind his eyelids, pursuing him in a place where escape was impossible. Time passed strangely. In the days that followed, John barely left the house and spoke to no one. The townspeople began to notice the change in him. He became withdrawn, constantly glancing over his shoulder, and his eyes, sunken and haunted, always seemed to be looking toward the forest, where the darkness was thicker and more menacing than anywhere else. But on the next Halloween night, the haunting reached its peak. As night fell, John heard strange noises just outside his window. At first, it was the soft rustling of leaves, then a faint scratching sound, as if someone were clawing at the window from outside. John sat motionless, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes fixed on the window, knowing that the thing he feared most had returned. In a moment of crazed courage, he stood up and yanked the curtains open. Dogman's red eyes appeared just inches from him, staring straight through the glass. The creature stood there, unmoving, its massive shadow stark against the faint light. Its eyes glowed like burning embers, and in the silence, John could feel Dogman's heavy breath through the glass, cold and filled with malice. John couldn't move. He was trapped by Dogman's gaze, feeling as though his soul was being drawn into those red eyes, imprisoned in an endless darkness. Then, Dogman smiled, a smile that was not of an animal, but of something from another realm, a smile full of hatred and patience, in a low voice that echoed within his mind. It whispered, "You are mine, and you will never escape." And then, like a ghost, Dogman faded into the night, leaving John with a fear that clung to his mind like a scar that would never heal. The next morning, the town of Michigan awoke to find that John was gone. His neighbors didn't know where he had gone, but they recalled that on Halloween night, they had heard deep, raspy screams and the sound of footsteps pounding through his house. The curious ones who went to check found only an empty home. There was no sign of John, The living room was left in disarray, as if someone had fled in a hurry. The townspeople began to talk, and the name Dogman returned to their lips with a vague sense of dread. Some said that Dogman was a curse, that it had possessed John from the night he dared to look into the creature's red eyes. As night fell, a few people swore they saw a dark figure lurking around John's old house, its red eyes shining in the darkness. And from that day on, every Halloween night, a pair of red eyes would appear at the edge of the forest, watching the townspeople, a reminder that Dogman was always waiting and that the fear John had awakened would haunt this place forever. And that was the terrifying Halloween night encounter with Dogman, a tale of a mythical creature that haunts Michigan with ultimate fear. They say the Dogman still lurks somewhere deep in the forest, ready to appear to anyone who dares trespass its territory, especially on Halloween night. So, if you ever drive through a dark forest and feel eyes watching you, remember the Dogman. Those red eyes may be waiting for you. Thank you for watching until the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chilling story. We'll see you again with more mysterious tales if you dare.